I am so glad that everybody has come along today for this special podcast. And I just readily admit that there are ways that I have heard about Dorothy Sayers for many years, but I unfortunately have not been a reader of Dorothy Sayers. So I want you to avoid my mistakes. And so to do that, I have brought in Kathryn Wehr, who is a scholar of Dorothy Sayers, and she has this great new volume out. I'm going to put it up on the screen, The Man Born to be King, and we're going to talk more specifically about it. But Kathryn has her PhD from the University of St. Andrews. She's a creative artist and scholar. She is the publisher. She's the editor of Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture. And so we are so glad, Kathryn, to have you into the podcast.
Yeah, great. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, just tell us a little bit about yourself, and that might help us understand how you got to the place of getting so in depth in this research about Dorothy Sayers and her plays.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm from Minnesota. That's where I'm broadcasting from here today. And I was raised Baptist, and I went to Bethel University here also in St. Paul. And then I discovered liturgy. So I was an Anglican for about 20 years. And then 7 years ago, I became Catholic. So that's why now I'm working in a Catholic context, but I feel like I'm, bilingual. And, but particularly from my time, as an Anglican, I got to know Dorothy L. Sayers, who is herself an Anglican, or was an Anglican. Yeah. So I first encountered The Man Born to be King. That was my first introduction to her work when I was a student at Regent College in Vancouver. And I just picked it off a book list. And because my first degree was in theater. So I thought, plays.
Yeah, sure.
This would be right up my alley. And so, but that was kind of my entrance into her work, because what I love about her is that she has all kinds of different genres. So that's why sometimes people aren't as familiar with her, because, or they might know just part of her work. So they might just know her mystery novels, or they might just know her work on Dante, which was like the last 13, 15 years of her life. They might just know some of her essays, which are amazing. Some of her wartime writings, which were all about like, what kind of world do we want to build once World War II is over. And then she has also poetry, and then all these plays. So she wrote both stage plays and radio plays. So it's just a treasure trove. And as someone who loves doing creative work, it gives me hope that there's always new time. There's time to develop a new idea, a new genre, to learn something new. Like she, her specialty from university was in medieval French, but she taught herself medieval Italian so that she could work on Dante. And that was in her 40s. So you think, well, I have plenty of time.
There you go. It's so interesting. Now, I think probably the way I knew her writing the most was just through the letters. Like various times there'd be letters published between her and the Inklings and other people. Mm-hmm. So, that was, and I'm kind of come to this podcast embarrassed that I haven't read her more. And then when I got into your book, I thought, man, I've really been missing out. What was her connection then to, it's kind of like through the famous Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and then probably a connection to G.K. Chesterton as well, that these are kind of like the heroes, and not just Christian evangelical intellectualism, and not just evangelical, but across traditions, as you've already indicated. And so that's probably the way that I knew her the most. But why is it because of the diversity of her writings that she's not been or maybe am I just somebody sitting in the dark too much? And what is it that keeps her from people attaching to her sooner?
I don't know. I think that's a good question. It's funny because during her lifetime, as you mentioned, so we know that she read a lot of G.K. Chesterton as a young woman. She writes in her letters back and forth with her parents, like, "Oh, you should read this," and also like 10 years before he actually became Catholic, she wrote to her parents, like, "I've heard he's about to, cross the Tiber." So that kind of thing. So that's interesting to note. So very influenced by him. So, and then she got to know Charles Williams. Yeah. I'm not really sure how, but he recommended, I think she just responded to one of his books by writing to him. I think that's how they first connected. But then he ended up recommending her to write a play for the Canterbury Festival, because he
Okay.
had written, what was it? Anyway, his Canterbury Festival play in probably 35 or 34. And then she ended up writing, through his influence, the 1936 Canterbury Festival play at Canterbury Cathedral. So these cathedrals at the time were doing these big arts festivals. So she wrote a play, which was called The Zeal of Thy House. So, but then she did get to know him more, and they met in person more later. Then you're trying to think, I think it was 1943 that she got to know C.S. Lewis. And I think because they had a mutual friend in Charles Williams. And so they got to know each other a little bit, but then once Charles Williams died, actually, they collaborated on a book of essays in his honor.
Okay.
And that really solidified their not only their friendship, but their kind of working friendship. Because then until she died in 1957, there's lots of letters between them about the things that each of them are writing. And so, because he was a medieval scholar, right? So she was working on Dante a lot. So she would say, well, what do you think about this? Or ask him different questions. He wrote her things, tried to rope her into a couple different projects. Like he tried to get her to write a book on sort of against women priests that became his essay, about priestesses, I think.
Interesting.
But she was like, no, but she gave him some advice. Like, stick with the historic precedents, I think will probably be the strongest argument. And then, yeah, so they had a fun relationship. And actually, there's a lot of fun little things. Like she would write him, make little drawings of her cats or her chickens, and they would go back and forth, joking. She wrote a whole letter to him very early in their friendship in the style of the Screwtape Letters.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
she loved that book so much. So she like created her own tempter and then wrote the letter from the point of view of her tempter to Screwtape. So.
Oh, interesting. Wow, it's fascinating. So how did you get so you did, I'm guessing, your doctoral research in writing on Dorothy L. Sayers. So
I did.
what was your, this book isn't, we're going to get into what makes it distinct, looking at the plays around the life of Christ, but what was your research in specifically?
Yeah. So I, when I was deciding on a doctoral topic, I thought of these plays because I had been using them as examples in a class I was teaching at North Central University. I was teaching a theology class, and it was kind of theology and the arts. And so I would always reserve a day to read one of the plays aloud or a few scenes. And so as I was trying to decide what I wanted to write on, I thought, well, what's something that I, at least know something about so far. And since I had written about it in my master's, I thought, well, why don't I see what research there is? And there really wasn't much at all.
Okay.
There wasn't a book about the plays. There wasn't even a full article about the plays. It was mentioned by all her biographers because it was very popular and, has been in and out of publication ever since 1943. And has been re-recorded by the BBC a couple times. And so it was mentioned, but let's say there's wide open for a researcher.
Okay.
So what I did is my first thought was to answer a couple questions that biographers were saying. Like they were saying, oh, she really prefers the Gospel of John. And I thought, okay, maybe, but how do we know that? No one is telling me why they think that's true. So that was like a question I was sort of testing. And then they also said, she eschews the King James Version. And I thought,
interesting.
Okay. And so but then I found some ways actually she uses it all over the place, just not for the main parts of the dialogue. But being able to test that. So and then also her theological themes. She said early on she wanted the theme to be the kingship of Christ. And I thought, well, no one really talks about how she develops that. So that's an opening. So so I ended up doing a dissertation, sort of a normal sort of book where a different chapter, one takes on her use of scripture, one on the use of the King James Version, and the Coverdale Psalms, which are the Psalm translation that are used in the Book of Common Prayer that Anglicans use. And then her secondary sources, because she, in her introduction, she credits several books, and there was one study that someone had done at a conference on that. So I started there, but found lots of other connections.
Right.
And then different theological themes. So, but it's the kind of book that, I mean, there's so much information there, but how can you make it useful to others? And so
Right.
that's what is so exciting about this new edition, is that I'm able to bring that information and make it useful to readers. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And the idea with she was approached by the BBC to develop these plays, and so
that's
when
right.
she did, she wanted to be very specific, and she was wanting to use common English, and she was wanting to like really making Christ a character was an issue for her, right? Like there'd be
Yes.
challenges with that, and certainly this was a controversial set of plays. Like after the first set was released, there was like
That's
a
right.
committee put. So tell us about some of that, like why this was such a dramatic event, or like her putting this out and what she was trying to do. And then I want to get into the ways that what you did in your volume to help us kind of like enjoy it more.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very interesting story. As you said, the BBC commissioned the plays, and she had already written one nativity play for the BBC that was a success. It was called He That Should Come, and it's just a 1-hour nativity play that takes place in sort of the yard of the inn in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
So that was a wonderful play, well loved by people. And so the BBC said, why don't we do a whole series of these? And the head of the BBC religious department, so the head of religious broadcasting, James Welch, he really had a very evangelistic desire. So he's saying, like, we need to help the heathen of this country get to know who Christ is. They're not reading their Bible, so why don't we put it on the radio? And that kind of thing, So, and she, she is obviously a Christian, a very active Christian, especially at this point. She's writing a lot of essays about spiritual themes, that kind of thing. So, she's definitely understands his point of view, but she feels very clearly that her job is to write the best plays possible.
Yeah.
And to not necessarily worry about, like, am I presenting this in a seeker-friendly way or something? Her whole theory is, if I present who Christ is and make it real to people, that he was a real person living at a real time, in real situations, real people coming to him to be healed, to push back on what he's saying, to, eventually crucify him, then people will, if I present Christ truly, Christ will do the work.
Right.
And the theology will speak for itself, in a sense. So she's famous for saying the dogma is the drama. Like,
Amen.
If we really understood what the creeds say, we would be shocked, and it would know that it's like the most dramatic thing in existence. That God actually became man and walked among us and then died for us, and rose again. So anyway, so that she so Welch asked her to write the plays. And then she had some very specific things right from the beginning. She had very clear ideas. So as you said, she wanted to use everyday English, which wasn't a given. A lot of people doing religious material on the BBC use the King James Version. But she really wanted Christ to be a character, which had not been done on the BBC.
It's so interesting. And when we think about our time with all the way back to the 70s or 80s with Jesus of Nazareth, to Mel Gibson, to even today with The Chosen. I mean, some of the same critiques that people offer about The Chosen is like the way that they play on some of the silences or create drama. Well, I mean, this is 80 years ago, and she's doing the exact same thing. But up to this point, Christ had not been a character.
That's right. And that's partly because of laws that were in place from the Reformation.
Wow.
That, there had been the mystery plays during the medieval times, and the English reformers felt like that was an excess. And then, of course, we had the Puritan Commonwealth time, which even put a kibosh on all theater. And so coming back after that, these laws were in place that no one could impersonate, was the word used, impersonate a member of the Holy Trinity. Wow. So there were many Christian plays, but you might have a play about Christ from the point of view of other people. So, the disciples telling the story, but Christ wouldn't appear, or there would be a voice from off stage, or
Yeah,
a
sure.
light, a shaft of light that would sort of represent Christ. And you can see there's a pious intention there. People are
Right,
wanting to be
sure.
respectful and not, not make it feel blasphemous. I mean, that's how it
Right,
felt.
sure.
But it also created a theological problem. It made it
Right.
seem that Christ wasn't a real human,
Yes.
and kind of
And
gave the wrong
Docetism
idea.
was something she was focused in on
Yeah.
the Docetic heresy. This was like she wanted to confront that and at the
Yeah.
same time balance out the Arian heresy as well.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's these wonderful letters with James Welch where they're kind of saying like, well, we sort of on both sides our silly culture. There's some people that are like, oh, Jesus, he was just a good guy and a good teacher, not
Yeah.
fully God. So that's Arianism. And then other people that, particularly Christians, who are like, oh, he's so other that he's not even really human.
Right.
And so she wanted to balance that. And I think she tries very hard in a lot of her scenes to do that, where she'll combine a miracle with Jesus. I think of, I mean, this is even in the scripture, but you think of the appearance in the upper room where, Jesus comes through the locked door, but then he asks for food and is given some broiled fish, right? So that there's this kind of balance of like, wow, he's doing something supernatural, but he's also human, and both of these things are present. So
yeah, that's obviously something she's wanting to do. And so by having Jesus be a real character, this is a dramatic move, and it got her in hot water. You want to tell us a little about the drama of? I keep on using the word drama. Obviously,
it is drama. Yeah,
tension. Yeah, absolutely. Like what happened? What happened historically, and then we'll get into your actual text.
Okay. Yeah. So the there, as I said, the laws had to do with plays. Now, radio was kind of a new thing, but it had not been tried on the radio. The part that I didn't say is that the laws were relaxed just before World War I. And so people were allowed to have Jesus be a character, but they actually needed permission from the government in order to include Jesus as a character. So they would approve scripts, that kind of thing. So radio, because of course, radio is a little more like the voice off stage, in a sense, like, well, there's not a person here pretending to be Jesus.
Right.
But they still felt like this is a big enough deal that we should get permission. So they did write a letter to the Lord Chamberlain, who gave official permission, which was really important because later, despite having that permission, there's still plenty of people who felt like it was, perhaps sacrilegious to have these kinds of plays. So in 1941, the first play was going to be broadcast on Christmas Day, 1941. And so they had a press conference, and Sayers read a little bit of the script. And it was a section where Matthew, the tax collector, was there. And as she has, very much unlike Chosen, she has made Matthew the all-knowing kind of, urban guy. So he's the East End London Cockney, who, knows what's what. And he, so she read a bit at the beginning of play 4, where he's kind of chiding Philip for getting a bad deal at the market. And then this ends up being a setup for Jesus to tell a parable. But the slang, that Matthew uses, people were shocked. And so then, but of course, this is a press conference, and all these press men are there to sell papers. And so they create these headlines that are like, Life of Christ plays in US slang.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they like to blame anything linguistic on the US.
Yeah.
Even though it's mostly Cockney slang.
Right.
But
or you also highlight gangsterism, right? They said, gangster. I thought that was funny.
Gangster slang.
Yeah.
And so, so then there's this wonderful group called the Lord's Day Observance Society, full of, I'm sure, wonderful, well-meaning Christians. But they took these headlines and took out huge full-page ads in like every newspaper they could, telling people to write to the BBC to protest these plays. Wow. Now, at this point, no one had heard any of them. They just heard a few lines that Sayers read at a press conference. but thousands of letters came to the BBC. And I've done some work in the BBC archives, and so they're all there, like the originals there, and
Wow. Yeah.
you can even
Yeah.
touch them. But my favorite is this this woman writing and saying, my daughter read some things out loud out of the paper and said, "Mommy, my Jesus doesn't talk that way."
Oh,
And then her saying, like, 9 out of 10 mothers in this small village beg and plead that you would stop this thing from going on the air. Like, people
wow.
were very, very worried about it.
Yeah, sure,
And
sure.
and people even, think 1941, right? The United States just
Right.
entered the war, but Britain had been at war since 1939. And so, things were looking very
No,
grave.
yeah.
And so people felt like if this is, sacrilegious, God won't be pleased. And, so there were people literally that wrote to the BBC saying, like, the fall of Singapore is your fault. Stop these plays.
Wow.
And that kind of thing. So it's
I
very,
mean, this causal
very serious.
connection between God's judgment and
Mhm.
for England violating this. And I think it's
Yeah.
hard for Americans. It's okay. It's hard for me. Let's just say
Yeah.
that I'm an American. It's hard to realize the connection between the BBC, the Church of England, and
Yeah.
this national identity, a
Mhm.
Christianized culture that's
Yeah.
so different from what we experienced. That like this was like a national issue for them. It seems like.
That's right. Yeah. There was even a question put in the House of Commons. So there's
Wow.
like a question time. And sometimes they show it on TV sometimes, where any question can be addressed to the members of the House. And so there was a question saying, what are you going to do about these plays? Like, should
Wow.
we stop them as the government? And the answer from the Prime Minister was like, we'll let the BBC handle this. So,
Okay.
but of course the BBC is funded by the government. So,
Right.
there's
It's
that
very different. Yeah.
connection.
Yeah. It's a very different context. Okay. I'm fascinated by, I really enjoyed these books or the plays, but what you've done is unique because like you say, she takes the gospels and she weaves them all together. She did like,
Mhm.
I don't know which one she emphasized based upon what I've read from you, but
Mhm.
she weaves them all together, even in the very first quotation. And tell us what makes your work distinct and how this helps make Dorothy Sayers' work more accessible.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I think when I started my research, I was often reading along and I would say to myself, now, which gospel is this story
Sure.
in? And I thought, oh, I wish there were footnotes in this edition that I had. And so that was the first kind of layer of the idea of this, is saying, I wish sometime, and maybe now that I'm working on these plays, it could be my job to create a version where at least all the Bible references are tracked. And then, of course, as I mentioned, that one of my goals was to analyze how she was doing scripture. So I actually took Kurt Aland's synopsis of the four Gospels, which is it takes the four Gospels and it puts it in 4 columns.
Right.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So I took that and used the same pericopes, we call the kind of chunks of biblical text.
Yep. Sure.
And then I created a 5th column for the man born to be king, so that I could track how she's
Interesting.
using these and then how they kind of overlap. So through that, which was a very exhaustive process, but it was exciting to be able then to analyze and even numerically. So I have an article that's published on her use of the Gospels, where I'm able to say, I don't have the numbers right at the top of my head, but this many times she references Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and this percentage of her material is from John or the synoptic Gospels, that kind of thing. And so just to say, I think she loves being very even. That's one of the things I was able to
Interesting.
say, that her favorite stories to cover, because then I could also look at what didn't she choose, so anything that had to do with the end times, anything that had to do with ritual purity, because originally
Okay.
these are for children. So she
Right,
kind of avoided those kinds of things, or teachings on divorce, or the woman caught in adultery.
Which is
Interestingly,
significant for her, right? I mean,
yeah.
I mean, sorry to jump in biographically what happened with her, but could you tell? I mean, that's one of the things that sometimes people bring up is she had a child out of wedlock, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, she did have a a short relationship with someone, a man who lived in her building. When this is back in, her son was born in January of 1924.
Okay.
So she was younger woman working at a what's the word I'm looking for? Advertising agency. There we
Okay.
go.
Yeah.
And Benson's Advertising. And but it turns out actually he was married. He had not told her that. And it was a very short-lived sort of relationship anyway. But so she had a son that ended up being raised by her cousin. So, but when she married a couple years later, her son was officially adopted by her husband.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So that's there. It's not something that she talked about even with her closest friends. It doesn't seem like she even told her parents at the time, because she wasn't, she was living in London. Her parents were in East Anglia. So yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry for interrupting, but it's interesting to me that she, and I think it's helpful because maybe not just for in her own biographical, the biographical story of what's happening in her life, but also this is for children. And like that was the clear intention that was given at her instructions. And so she was glad to accommodate that. And it's interesting as she's like working through this, like she's bringing in different sources all along the way. So she's even, you said, with what she's able to do. Now, also, you decided to do more than that, though, than just highlight her scriptural sources. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So if you look at a page, there's footnotes with all the Bible references, and then there are side columns. And that's where I put all the other goodies that I found.
Put it on the screen for the people look on YouTube.
Look at that. Right. So there are things that appear on the side. There might be excerpts from her letters, because her letters back and forth with James Welch were very interesting. She'd send him a script and she'll say, you'll notice that I did this. Like, you'll notice that I've gone with the composite Mary, meaning Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, the sinful woman of Luke 7, which was a tradition. And so she's knowingly choosing that. And she says, like, I know that, scholars have been starting to say, it's still pretty new at that time, that these were different women, but I can't have all these Marys running around. And I, for the sake of drama, I am choosing to combine them. And frankly, people like Augustine or Gregory the Great, they thought that they probably were the same person. So I'd rather be in their company than these newfangled modern scholars.
Right.
No, you don't have to agree with that, but at least you can be like, what? Oh, I see. Okay. At least she knew what she was doing. She was making a specific choice, not just like, oh, oops,
Yeah, sure. And you show even his interactions as well at times, like where he say, oh, I get this now. Like these little points.
Yeah. And so the letters are just delightful. And then there's also fan letters. So sometimes someone will write to her and either ask her to explain something or complain. Like one of the other things that, stands out for readers today is that she describes Jesus several times as having a gold beard or golden hair. And so when I was first going through it, before I had seen this letter where she explains it, I was like, oh, Dorothy, because it just seemed so silly. But so someone wrote and says, don't you know Jesus had black hair? He, lived in the Middle East. And she's like, well, you know what? You're probably right. He probably did have dark hair. But for my readers, I'm trying to help them connect to, famous works of art, which often show Jesus with a kind of goldish hue. Like I chose that for the sake of drama, also like radio drama. I need something that can, be reported auditorily, so that the people can get a picture in their mind as they're listening. Like, okay, how could someone pick out something, someone it's like, who is that? The one getting into the water there with John, the baptism scene, Oh, you mean the one with the short gold beard? So she does that kind of thing. I personally wouldn't choose that. There'd be a different kind of conversation if like, Jesus in The Chosen had been blonde or something.
Yeah, sure.
But it's there, but at least you can now read her letter and see what she was thinking, even if you disagree with her.
That she didn't even think about. And this is a challenge of maybe even why there was some wisdom in not having Jesus be a character, not having Jesus be. Now, I'm not saying I'm glad for this, but I had a conversation, a podcast with the illustrator and storyteller of the Action Bible.
Oh, fun.
It's one of the best-selling books by that publisher. It's done by a guy who's worked for DC and Marvel, and it's a fascinating. I mean, my kids loved it. But Jesus is like a superhero with biceps and all. I mean, just like like a very looks like Superman. And so I asked him about that and whether or not he should do that. And he's white. And then and part of me, it being a situation where often working in urban situations, like I struggle with presenting Jesus as one, as if he came from one region and all this sort of thing. And there's a way that you kind of I want to resist some of that. But he said something interesting. He's like, well, I just wanted Jesus to be as awesome as he could be to all the kids who could read it. And he's like, Jesus is great. And I mean, it's a very simple explanation, but I think there's something similar. It's like, well, if we're going to make him a character, well, he needs to have a look. And I'm sorry if that offends you, but I chose a gold beard. So it probably wasn't anything that was like very specific, but it was her desire to kind of move away from this docetic, probably spiritualized version of who Jesus had been.
Yeah. So it's just like a detail that even from her letter, it sounds like she wasn't particularly attached to it. But it was something that she kept consistent through the plays. It's only maybe 5 times over the course of 5 plays does someone kind of refer to his gold hair. But, does it mean like pure blonde or just sort of a little bit of gold, gold flecks in with his dark hair? Who knows? But yeah, so those, we were talking about the side column. So the letters are there. And then sometimes, because as I said, I read all her secondary sources. So she used a couple commentaries and then some other gospel adaptations. For instance, there's one like Morrison's Who Moved the Stone is something that people even read today. So that was one of her sources. So where there are important connections, where the author of one of the other books says something very similar, or I think that it might have influenced her, I put a little excerpt or even just a reference in the column for those who might want to look those up or just see. And so,
Moffat as well. Moffat's translation was something that she leaned into too.
Yeah, Moffat is a little harder. There's one spot, where she puts in Jesus' mouth words from the book of Proverbs about the wisdom of God being there at creation. Right. And she uses a word that I could only find in Moffat. His translation of the New Testament was playing. I was there playing with the world, playing, and so that's the only one for sure that I think comes from Moffat, but she recommends the Moffat translation to some other people in a letter. So I know that she was at least familiar with it. But otherwise, as I mentioned, she does use the King James. Her narrator character, who she calls Evangelist, uses mostly King James. And sometimes she'll just adapt it slightly. She might knit 2 pieces together, but they're very clearly using the King James language. But otherwise, there are times where she's using the Revised Version, which was really the only other major version that was available at the time. Right. But then also using her Greek New Testament. She and Welch go back and forth, sometimes talking about different Greek words. So we know she was using that. In his introduction, Welch says, she was translating from the Greek, which I think is a little strong. Because she's clearly harmonizing, so you can't just translate and harmonize at the same time. But she's really putting it in her own words, because she's going for this colloquial English for her characters. But we know she's using all these things. So it's like, she's like a scholar, even though she's writing popular plays for the radio, she's using all of these available tools to her. and doing it really well. Like she didn't even have to, it's a popular book. She wouldn't have had to have mentioned that she used these other books as sources, but she takes the time to, cite them sort of in her introduction. And then they're there for us now. And I tried my best to find good connections to them. So yeah,
and
so
this
those
is not, in
are
a sense, your book isn't exactly it's scholarly in the sense that it was based on your scholarly research, but as you go through, it's not like footnotes and like you're not detailing, but it's clear, short, little, and even the way that it's noted is just through underlined words. So like when you underline something, you put a note out to the side that helps you understand what she is harmonizing, what she is bringing in from other sources. And I think it certainly adds to the richness of it. I really appreciate you doing this because, like I said, I was Sayers ignorant, like just reading a few letters, but it just helps me see the depths of what she did in these in these plays. I want to just hit two portions of two plays that I think highlights it made it significant to me. And part of it is I'm at this very moment reading. I didn't read it for a long time. The Everlasting Man. I tried to read it in my 20s and I felt like it was just too much. I couldn't get it. And I'm coming back at it now in my 40s. And so I'm enjoying it. And I see this clear connection. And then also it's something that this scene from the very beginning, the very first play, reminds me also of something in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia in the last battle, where they're describing the impact of this baby being the creator of the universe. So you'll probably know where I'm coming here, but this is Mary's word. She's quoting Mary. It's on page 72 of your book. Mary says, I feel as though I were holding the whole world in my arms, the sky and the sea and the green earth and all the seraphim. And then again, everything becomes quite simple and familiar. And I know that he is just my own dear son. If he grew up to be wiser than Moses, holier than Aaron, and more splendid than Solomon, that would still be true. He will always be my baby, my sweet Jesus, whom I love. Nothing can ever change that.
Yeah.
And this is highlighting, I mean, some of these, I mean, what is she doing there, even in that passage, that's indicative of the rest of this, of these plays?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, that's a wonderful example of her holding together the hypostatic union of Christ's divinity and his humanity. And that, I mean, in a way, you think theologically, at the Council of Ephesus, when the title Theotokos was given to the Virgin Mary, that like it's actually a Christological title, right? Of whom is she the mother? The mother of God. And so it's the same thing here. Like the Virgin Mary in this scene is kind of the guarantee of the theology of who Jesus is, that she recognizes he is my son in a very human way. But there's also this other part of him that is connected to God,
Yes,
and the seraphim and the stars and whatever else she says there, that there's this Christ's two natures, both fully present, even as an infant.
Oh man, it reminds me from the last battle where there is this, I can't remember quite the same, the exact words, but where they're inside the not the tent, but the little cottage. And it's like the whole world is inside that little area. It's like a similar idea. Okay. The other one I wanted to highlight, and I think this hits like a way, her interpretive techniques throughout this, I think at least, is in the story of Mary and Martha, the famous kind of like Mary and Martha moment. And in that, she does something really unique. Like she comes in and Jesus says, highlights, like, remember this other story? I'm just going to, instead of reading it, remember this other story I told you? And she's like, you're kind of reminding me of that story. Jesus says, you're reminding me of that story I told you about the prodigal son. Like, so that's how she gets at telling these. And then Jesus, in the scene of Mary and Martha, tells the parable of the prodigal son, retells the story. I love, I mean, this is the type of thing that you have all throughout these plays, right? And I love this. It gives you a chance to comment on some of the things that you love about the plays. Those are two that stand out to me, to like just encourage our listeners to pick this book up.
Yeah, well, it's a great example because she uses scripture in so many different ways. So it could be that the scene itself shows the scene, like Christ giving a talk of, including a
Yeah, sure.
parable or whatever, or interacting with the Pharisees in John 6 about, eating my flesh and drinking my blood or whatever. And so sometimes there's a actual, dramatic presentation of the scene, but sometimes a scene is told in remembrance, like Jesus tells his first disciples about the temptation. Instead of having a scene where Jesus interacts with Satan, Jesus tells the story. And then they're able to kind of discuss it as they go along. And the disciples are like, oh, what? Oh, so they react. And so then we get drawn into the story in a different way. And then, like, for instance, the scene you're talking about is a perfect example. Something Sayers says in her letters that, like, Jesus was a preacher. Preachers tell the same stories all the time, in different ways. So she's actually showing there that, because he says to Martha, do you remember that story I told you? And she's like, oh yeah, about the one that went, into the far country and wasted all his money. And then he says, but did I tell you about the older brother?
Wow. Yeah.
And she says, no, the story ended with the father, creating a feast. So then it's like Jesus tells the story of the older brother as a way to help Martha understand her situation, vis-a-vis Mary. And so it's interesting because it's showing that, like, something that Sayers talks about, like, Jesus surely used stories in slightly different ways. So that's part of how when she's looking at the Gospels and seeing, the slight differences between different accounts of the same story, slightly different ending or slightly different situation or whatever, that, well, sure, Jesus would, of course, tell the same story in a few different settings. And so there's nothing, it's not about, like, which one is original. Probably both, hypothetically, he could have told the same story 50 times, the same parable. So just to different audiences at different times. So yeah, but I love that. And that's another one where she really blends Christ's humanity and divinity in that scene, because you mentioned we talked earlier about where he quotes in that same scene from the book of Proverbs.
Right.
So but he says it, and she even has a sort of an aside for John as like a character note saying, like, ooh, he's, who, it sounds almost biographical, that it's like, Lord, of whom is that said?
Yeah, I have it. Let me read it. Oh,
okay.
That's perfect. It says, Jesus says dreamingly.
Yeah.
Which is such interesting. I mean, of course, it's helpful to think of Jesus dreaming. I just had on, I don't know if it'll come out about the same time, a guy who has written a book on Jim Smith on Rich Mullins, the Christian singer. And he wrote a song about Jesus being a boy and playing, and, little girls blushing when he walked by, these type of things. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's helpful to think of these things because Jesus was a real man, a real boy. But okay, so Jesus says, when he established the foundations of the earth, I was with him, forming all things, and I was delighted every day, playing before him, playing in the world, and delighting myself among the sons of God. And then you have this great thing where you kind of like highlight how that's connected to Moffat's translation of Proverbs. Mm-hmm. And then he's master, a little startled. It sounds almost autobiographical. Master, of whom is that said? And Jesus responds, of the word and the wisdom of God. And then you have another link, of course, to what he might be applying with the wisdom of God.
Yeah.
And this is an interpretive move that she's making, but it's helping us get a fuller picture of Jesus. I love it.
Yeah. But it's also paired earlier in the scene with Martha asking the disciple John, like, what kind of stuffing does Jesus like? Fig stuffing, olive stuffing, dates, and John's like, I don't know, fig stuffing. But again, it's like this very human thing. Like, well, of course he probably had things that tasted good to him, that he might have preferred olives over figs, or vice versa. But that paired with this very divine moment. And she even calls it his God consciousness, which as a theologian, I was like, oh, because that sounds like Schleiermacher, who used that word, that term, God consciousness, to mean like, instead of being truly divine, maybe Jesus just was sort of conscious of his godness and sort of grew into it, which is not what Sayers means here. She just means that he's like most conscious of being God at this moment. And it kind of comes to the top. So, but those things together, this kind of very homey, what kind of stuffing does he like? And he was there at creation.
Yeah, he was playing. He was playing around like, Oh, I love it. What you mentioned to me before we came on that the Wade Center was really helpful to you, which is at Wheaton College. You want to just tell us a little bit about that and what's happening there and how that helped you in your research?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a Wade Annotated Edition. So I collaborated with the Wade Center because they have the largest archive of material about Sayers, materials of hers in the world. So it's the place to go if you're interested in Sayers. But they also cover 6 other authors as well. So the 4 Inklings, as well as G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald. So it's a wonderful place. They have a little museum there, actually, with C.S. Lewis's wardrobe.
Wow, interesting.
Yes.
How can you beat that?
I know. They have Tolkien's desk and a desk, I think that belonged to Lewis as well, and other things. They have actually Sayers eyeglasses there in the museum.
Okay.
Which is kind of fun. And but then there's this room called the reading room that is just lined with books. It's like a scholar's dream, and big tables where you can work, and then you can ask for them to bring up particular items from the archives in the basement that you can look at there in the reading room. So that's where I looked at thousands of her pages of her letters. They have 34,000 pages of her letters. I didn't get through all of them in preparation for this book, but anything from this time period, and specifically, especially looking very closely at the ones that are related to these plays, back and forth with James Welch, and then all the fan letters. So that's a wonderful, it's just a very fun place. And the reading room even has like a big fireplace with lions on the side, and you're like, oh, I'm here, so people just love to come in and sit there, but it's a great place to visit. They also have events, different scholars come. They even have like summer programs for kids. It's a really wonderful place. People that live in the Chicago area should definitely get to know it, but it's really worth a visit as well.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. Now, if you had to recommend one performance of the plays, can you tell us like where to go to find, like, is there, there's some online, just on YouTube, but is there one that you feel like really captures what she was after?
Well, I will say that there's really only one version available, so that makes it easy.
Okay, there you go.
And as a Sayers person, I will ask you to please get the ones that are on Audible and ignore the ones that are on YouTube, because those are breaking copyright. Whoever put them up should not have put them up. It's some private person, and I'm sure the Sayers trustees are eager to find that person who's put them on YouTube to get them down. So to make it safe, but you can just buy them on Audible, and then you'll have them forever, and they'll be in your iTunes, and you don't have to keep going back to YouTube. But so what is, sorry, all of that, that's my little soapbox.
Yeah, I'm glad to know it's there. And I just figured, because I just did a quick search, recordings on a Google search, and several came up in different places. And then there's some people who just do readings. And so I didn't know if there's any others that have been recorded. So who knows what even I saw. So I'm so glad to know, go to Audible. Right?
Yeah.
Like, we're going to check that
Audible. Out. And so, you can get them straight from Audible or through Amazon, which owns Audible. So those are the 1967 recordings by the BBC. And I think they're lovely. They're very well recorded. I love all the different voices. It really gives you a sense. They are shortened versions of every recording that there's 3 different recordings that the BBC made. And all of them are shortened. I mean, this is when Sayers actually published her scripts in 1943, she was like, I can finally put back everything that I want got cut for time. So the scripts themselves are longer than any version that's recorded, but the actual, even the original scripts were about 50 minutes or 55.
Okay.
But the ones that aren't Audible are like 40 to 43 minutes. I think maybe 43 is the longest. So, so there are things cut.
Gotcha.
But they're great. I really enjoy them.
It's
But
fun to hear
as
them
you,
because go ahead,
go
keep
ahead.
going. But
I
you
was
said
just going to
but.
say, but my favorite thing to do is actually just to get a group of friends together and read them aloud, because that's a great
Yes.
way to do it.
So would you do that with students too? You said you've taught this book, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that,
Yeah.
thanks for the tips on how to access it. Cause like, it's one
Yeah.
thing, reading plays, maybe that's not something people are used to doing, but, it just comes alive in a unique way. And here we
Yeah.
just, we're recording this just as Lent has started. So I encourage people,
Mhm.
hopefully this will come out while Lent is still happening, but it'd be a great thing to do, particularly in Holy Week, to work through these.
Yes. Well, in that, I mean, that's a good connection, because C.S. Lewis famously read these every year during Holy Week.
Okay.
And it's not just something we say, like she sent them to him in 1943, just when they were published, and he read them and he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear when they were broadcast last year, so, but
Okay.
I love them. And then they were actually rebroadcast many years in a row. So he probably did hear them, but there are letters then in, I think 1944, he's like, I am rereading The Man Born to be King. And then a couple years later, I am, as always, rereading The Man Born to be King during Holy Week. And then another time in the 50s, it stands up to this kind of test very well. And then in 1957, when she died, he wrote a panegyric for her, kind of a tribute. And he said, I read The Man Born to be King every year during Holy Week.
Wow.
So I recommend that to
Sounds like
your
a good idea.
readers, to your listeners.
C.S. Lewis did. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for your time and for
Yeah.
working on this book and for taking your research and making it something that can help readers understand and enjoy Dorothy Sayers even more.
Thank
I always
you.
end my podcast with a question, the more to the story question. That's the name of my podcast. But I love that, connect that maybe to you specifically. We know more of the story behind this book and your research and Dorothy Sayers herself. But is there more to the story of Kathryn Wehr than is normally told? You have some hobbies that you don't get to talk about very much, or something you're interested in?
Um, I guess the only thing I would mention is that, and partly thanks to these plays, because while I was working on these plays, I also wrote an album of songs about women in the Gospels.
Okay.
So that's on my website, also on, iTunes,
Are you a
Amazon,
performer? Like you sung the songs?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't, since COVID, as I haven't really done many concerts. But anyway, they're wonderful songs. On my YouTube channel, actually, I've turned some of them into videos and that kind of thing. So you can hear some of them there. Otherwise, you can hear them on, Spotify. But some of them are directly related to these plays.
Okay.
Like I borrow something that the scene of James and John asking Jesus to sit on his left and right.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think, I think is it maybe in Mark or Luke where they ask Jesus specifically, and I think it's in Matthew where their mother Salome asks
Okay.
for them. And so I wrote a song about Salome. So I have Salome doing the asking, and then have her there at the foot of the cross, but borrowing something that Sayers has John say, because she has John saying, he's there at the foot of the cross. We didn't know what we were asking when we asked to sit on your right and left, but here these spots have been taken by two thieves.
Wow.
And so I put that in Salome's mouth. Is this what, could this be what your kingdom means?
Oh, yeah.
So it, anyway, so lots of connections there, but it was
It's
a
great
really
to know you're a
fun
musician.
project.
Yeah, that
I
didn't come
am.
up at all. So you have a YouTube channel. Was it just your name, or how can people find out more information about you?
Yep. Kathryn Wehr, KathrynWehr. And so kathrynwehr.com or just Kathryn Wehr at YouTube. And so along with some of my music stuff, I do some other videos or kind of like slideshows where I would pair poetry or some thoughts to different topics. It was sort of a COVID goal that I would create one a month. So I have slowed
Okay.
down. But I also have a couple of videos that relate to this book that give people kind of a quick look and then a more in-depth look at the book as well that I have put up there. So
That's great. Thank you so
yeah,
much for coming on. It's really a treat to meet you. And thanks again for your work on this project. I'm sure it's going to help people understand Jesus better, but also
I
appreciate
hope
Dorothy
so.
Sayers. So thank you for your
Thanks.
work.
Yeah, such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.